My beloved child. Do not move past this moment too quickly, because there is a question your heart has carried in silence, and tonight that question stands closer to an answer than it has ever been before. You have wondered whether the person who lost you ever truly understood what happened. You have asked yourself whether your absence meant anything to them, whether the love you gave left a mark, whether the nights you cried alone were mirrored by even one moment of regret in their heart. And although this is a fictional message of spiritual reflection, let it meet you where your pain has been hiding, because the truth within this story is not as simple as someone missing you. They are struggling to forgive themselves. But what they cannot forgive is not only the fact that they lost you. It is the moment they finally realized they had been holding something precious while treating it as though it would always remain. There was a time when your presence felt ordinary to them, not because you were ordinary, but because you were consistent. You answered. You cared. You stayed longer than your own heart could afford. You remembered small details that everyone else forgot. You noticed the quiet changes in their voice. You could sense when something was wrong even when they insisted they were fine. You offered patience where another person might have walked away. And somewhere in the safety of your devotion, they became careless. They believed your love would continue waiting at the same door, no matter how many times they arrived late. They believed your forgiveness had no ending. They mistook your gentleness for an inability to leave. What they did not understand was that your heart was not weak. It was loyal. There is a difference. Weakness remains because it cannot move. Loyalty remains because it has chosen to hope. And when hope is repeatedly wounded, even the most loyal heart eventually learns that leaving can be an act of love toward itself. That is what happened inside you. Not suddenly. Not in one dramatic instant. Your departure began quietly, long before anyone could see it. It began on the night you stared at your phone and decided not to explain your feelings again. It began when you swallowed the words you had spoken too many times. It began when you stopped asking questions because you already knew the answers would leave you feeling more alone. It began when your tears became quieter, when your expectations became smaller, when the dream you once protected started feeling heavier than the reality you were living. You did not stop loving them in one moment. You stopped abandoning yourself. And that change carried a force they were not prepared to face. At first, they did not understand the difference. They may have noticed that your messages became shorter, that your energy felt more distant, that you no longer reached across every silence to repair what they had broken. Yet part of them still believed you would return to the familiar pattern. They thought you would eventually soften, eventually call, eventually become the version of yourself who always made the first move toward peace. But the silence continued. Days carried your absence into places where your presence had once lived. A song played, and they remembered the way you listened. Someone laughed in a crowded room, and for half a second, it sounded like you. They opened a conversation and nearly typed your name. They reached for the comfort of your attention and discovered that comfort was no longer available on demand. That was the beginning of their regret, but it was not yet the beginning of their deepest pain. Regret often begins with inconvenience. A person misses what someone did for them. They miss the reassurance, the companionship, the familiar voice at the end of a difficult day. But true remorse begins later, when they stop grieving what they received and start understanding what they failed to give. That realization did not come all at once. It arrived in fragments. A quiet room after midnight. Rain tracing slow lines down a dark window. A phone resting face up on a table, silent for longer than they expected. A memory they had avoided returning without permission. In this fictional story, imagine them sitting alone in that room, surrounded by ordinary things that suddenly feel like witnesses. The light is low. The world outside continues as if nothing has changed. Cars pass. A distant door closes. Somewhere, another person laughs. Yet inside that room, time seems to have stopped around one unbearable thought. You really may not be coming back. They had considered this possibility before, but they never allowed it to become real. They treated it like a temporary fear, something their pride could dismiss. They told themselves that you needed space. They told themselves that you were emotional. They told themselves that what you shared was too strong to end. But on that night, one hidden detail shattered those comforting explanations. They remembered the last time you looked at them with disappointment. Not anger. Not accusation. Disappointment. There was something in your eyes that they did not recognize then. You were still physically present, but a part of you was already saying goodbye. You were not trying to punish them. You were trying to understand how someone you loved could repeatedly make you feel invisible. They remembered how you paused before speaking. They remembered how carefully you chose your words. They remembered that you did not ask for perfection. You asked for honesty. You asked for consistency. You asked not to be made to feel foolish for caring. And they remembered what they did next. Perhaps they changed the subject. Perhaps they became defensive. Perhaps they made your pain about their discomfort. Perhaps they promised something they did not sustain. The exact details belong to fiction and reflection, not a claim about anyone's private life. Yet the emotional truth remains familiar. Sometimes a person does not recognize the final plea because it sounds too much like all the pleas that came before it. They assumed there would be another conversation. Another chance. Another version of you willing to explain. That assumption is what now follows them into silence. Because now they understand that your final request was never merely about one argument. It was an invitation. You were inviting them to meet you more deeply. You were asking them to step out of avoidance and into truth. You were offering them a chance to protect the bond before your heart could no longer survive inside it. They did not see the invitation. They only heard pressure. And by the time they understood the difference, you had changed. This is the part they cannot forgive themselves for. They did not lose you because you stopped being worthy of love. They lost you because they kept behaving as though your love made consequences impossible. There is a painful kind of awakening that comes when a person realizes the relationship did not end because love was absent. It ended because love was present, but maturity was not. Care existed, but courage did not. Feelings were real, but accountability was delayed. They had love in their hands. They just did not know how to hold it without hurting it. And now every memory carries two meanings. What once seemed small now feels sacred. The morning you checked on them even though you were exhausted. The message you sent after an argument, not because you were wrong, but because peace mattered more to you than pride. The way you encouraged their dreams while quietly neglecting your own needs. The moments when you noticed their pain and made room for it, even as yours went unseen. They are beginning to remember not only what happened between you, but who you were while it was happening. That is the memory breaking them open. Not one grand romantic moment. Not one dramatic goodbye. Your consistency. The quiet way you loved. The things you did without demanding applause. The emotional shelter you became while pretending you were not tired. They once believed those things were simply part of your personality, gifts that would appear wherever you went and therefore did not need to be protected. Now they understand that your love was not automatic. It was a choice you made again and again. And one day, you chose differently. Not because your heart had become cold. Because it had become awake. Your awakening confused them. They may have called it distance. They may have interpreted your boundaries as punishment. They may have believed you were trying to prove a point. But you were not trying to win. You were trying to breathe. For too long, you measured your worth by their ability to recognize it. You waited for them to become certain. You waited for them to choose you without hesitation. You waited for an apology that carried changed behavior instead of temporary emotion. Then something sacred shifted within you. You began to see that waiting for someone else's clarity was costing you your own. Perhaps there was no lightning, no dramatic sign, no voice from the sky. Perhaps it was simply a quiet realization while you were alone: I cannot keep doing this to myself. That sentence became a doorway. You stepped through it trembling. And heaven, in this fictional language of light and symbolism, did not shame you for leaving what was hurting you. Heaven stood beside you as you remembered that forgiveness does not always require access, that compassion does not always require reunion, and that love does not demand the destruction of dignity. Your departure was not a curse against them. It was a rescue of you. Yet there is something else unfolding in their regret, and this is where the story deepens. They are not only grieving the relationship. They are grieving the version of themselves they became inside it. For a long time, they told themselves that their mistakes were caused by timing, stress, fear, confusion, or circumstances. Some of those things may have been true. People often act from wounds they have never learned to name. They may withdraw when closeness feels dangerous. They may become inconsistent when love demands vulnerability. They may push away the person they care about because losing control frightens them more than losing the relationship. Understanding this does not erase the harm. But it reveals why their guilt has become so complicated. They know they were afraid. They also know you paid the price for that fear. They recognize now that each time you offered closeness, they tested it. Each time you offered reassurance, they questioned it. Each time you created safety, they waited for betrayal and sometimes acted as though it had already happened. You became responsible for wounds you did not create. You tried to prove you were different from everyone who had disappointed them before. But no amount of love can permanently heal a person who refuses to face their own pain. That lesson cost you dearly. And now it is costing them. Because after you left, they began encountering themselves without the cushion of your understanding. There was no one translating their silence into hidden pain. No one excusing their distance as fear. No one reminding them of the goodness inside them after they behaved carelessly. They were left with the echo of their own choices. An echo can be a merciless teacher. It returns what was sent out. In the quiet, they heard the words they had spoken to you. They remembered the conversations they avoided. They replayed the moments when you reached out and they withheld warmth because they wanted control. They saw how often your tenderness was met with uncertainty. And gradually, an uncomfortable truth rose to the surface. They had been asking you to prove your love while refusing to prove they were safe to love. That realization changed the meaning of everything. It meant your departure was not evidence that you had failed them. It was evidence that their unresolved patterns had finally created the outcome they feared most. They feared abandonment, so they acted in ways that made connection impossible. They feared rejection, so they rejected vulnerability first. They feared losing power, so they withheld the very affection that might have built trust. And eventually, they lost you. This is why self-forgiveness feels beyond their reach. They cannot blame fate anymore. They cannot blame timing forever. They cannot blame you without hearing the dishonesty in their own thoughts. Some part of them knows the truth. You gave them opportunities. Not endless opportunities, because no one owes another person endless access to their heart. But enough chances for honesty to become possible. Enough patience for growth to begin. Enough grace for change to have somewhere to land. They postponed that change. Now they are trying to become the person you needed after you no longer need them to become it. There is a specific kind of sorrow in being too late. It is not loud every day. Sometimes it hides beneath work, conversation, routine, and distraction. They may appear normal. They may smile. They may speak with others. They may even convince themselves for hours that they have accepted what happened. Then something small brings the truth back. A familiar phrase. The hour you used to call. A photograph they forgot existed. The memory of how your face changed when you realized they were not listening. Suddenly the room grows quiet again. And beneath every memory is the same question. Why did I not understand while I still had the chance? But listen carefully, because your healing must not become chained to their regret. This message is not asking you to wait for their remorse to transform into a reunion. It is not promising that they will return, apologize, or become who you once hoped they would be. Their awakening belongs to their journey. Your dignity belongs to yours. The most important revelation may not be that they regret losing you. It may be that you no longer need their regret to validate what you survived. For a long time, you wanted acknowledgement. You wanted them to look at the damage and say, "I see what I did." You wanted your pain to be recognized because unrecognized pain can feel unreal. When someone hurts you and then continues living as though nothing happened, you begin questioning your own experience. Was I asking for too much? Was I too sensitive? Did I imagine the connection? Did my sacrifices mean anything? Your heart has repeated those questions in different forms. And every time you did not receive clarity, you tried to create it from fragments. But there is a truth your spirit has been slowly learning. Their inability to appreciate you did not reduce your value. Their confusion did not make your love foolish. Their avoidance did not make your needs unreasonable. Their silence did not mean your story was insignificant. Sometimes the person who wounded you understands your worth only after losing access to it. Yet by then, your worth is no longer waiting for their recognition. It has begun returning home to you. This is the transformation they did not expect. They thought losing you would mean you remaining somewhere nearby in emotional suspension. They imagined that even if the relationship changed, your heart would remain turned toward them in the same way. But healing changed the direction of your attention. You began noticing your own life again. At first, it may have felt empty. Freedom can feel like loneliness when you have spent a long time confusing emotional struggle with connection. Peace can feel unfamiliar when your nervous system has learned to expect uncertainty. There were days you missed them intensely. Days when one memory nearly erased every reason you left. Days when you wanted to reach back, not because the situation had changed, but because the ache felt too heavy to carry. Still, you kept moving. Not perfectly. Not without tears. But honestly. You began building small acts of self-trust. You stopped explaining your boundaries to people committed to misunderstanding them. You allowed silence to remain unanswered. You learned that closure is sometimes created through acceptance rather than conversation. Little by little, your energy changed. And they sensed it. Perhaps not through anything supernatural, but through the ordinary evidence of separation. You stopped circling back. You stopped leaving hidden doors open. You stopped offering emotional reassurance from a distance. Your absence became complete. That completeness frightened them more than anger would have. Anger can still feel like attachment. Silence can still hide hope. But acceptance has a different presence. Acceptance does not chase. It does not argue. It does not demand that another person understand. It simply gathers its heart and walks forward. They began to realize you were not performing a disappearance to make them react. You were becoming someone who could survive without the answer you once begged them to give. This is when regret turned into grief. Before that, they missed you. Now they understood they had lost a version of your love that may never exist for them again. Even if paths crossed. Even if words were spoken. Even if forgiveness eventually softened the memory. The person who loved them without hesitation had been changed by what happened. You could forgive and still never return to the same innocence. You could wish them healing and still deny them access. You could remember the good and still honor the reasons you left. That is a truth they are struggling to accept. They do not merely want another chance. In their deepest regret, they want to return to the moment before they damaged your trust. They want the impossible. They want your old belief in them. They want the version of your eyes that did not yet know disappointment. They want to hear your voice before it learned how to protect itself. But time does not move backwards simply because someone finally understands. And there is mercy in that, even when it hurts. Because if every regret could erase consequences, growth would become optional. Their remorse is becoming a teacher. It is showing them that love cannot survive indefinitely on potential. It needs presence. It needs honesty when honesty feels uncomfortable. It needs action that matches intention. They may have cared about you deeply. But caring silently while behaving carelessly still creates pain. They may have imagined a future with you. But imagining a future while neglecting the present does not protect a relationship. They may have believed they would change someday. But someday can become the place where love goes to disappear. Now they know. And knowing has unsettled everything. There is a moment in this fictional story that they return to more than any other. It is not the argument they thought ended everything. It is not the last message. It is not even the goodbye. It happened earlier. You were together in an ordinary place. Nothing dramatic surrounded you. Perhaps evening light rested against the wall. Perhaps there was music in the background. Perhaps you were speaking about something small. Then you looked at them and smiled. Not a performative smile. Not the polite expression you offer the world. A real smile. The kind that appeared because, in that moment, you felt safe enough to be completely present. They remember that expression now because they know they were once trusted with your unguarded heart. And they remember how casually they received it. That memory has become unbearable. They would give anything to return to that second and recognize what was happening. They would look more carefully. They would listen longer. They would understand that trust is not merely a feeling. It is a gift, and gifts can be lost through neglect. One memory changed everything. When that image returned, they stopped thinking only about how lonely they felt without you. They started thinking about how lonely you must have felt beside them. That was the turning point. Until then, their regret centered around their pain. Afterward, they began seeing yours. They imagined the nights you waited for reassurance that never came. They considered how many times you rewrote a message to avoid sounding demanding. They thought about the emotional courage it took for you to communicate your needs, only to be met with uncertainty. They saw the relationship through your eyes. And for the first time, they did not like who they were in the story. This is where self-forgiveness becomes difficult. Forgiving oneself requires honest accountability, but accountability can feel like standing in a room without shadows. There is nowhere for excuses to hide. They cannot become innocent again. They can only become responsible. Yet part of them still resists that truth. They move between remorse and defense. One moment they admit everything. The next, they tell themselves you also made mistakes. And perhaps you did. No human relationship is shaped by one flawless person and one entirely broken person. But your imperfections do not cancel the pattern that exhausted you. They know this. Even when pride tries to build another explanation, their heart returns to the same evidence. You tried. You spoke. You waited. You changed. Then you left. And your leaving was quieter than they expected because the loudest part had already happened inside you. There were so many invisible goodbyes. The first time you stopped sharing your deepest thoughts. The first time you cried and did not tell them. The first time you imagined a future without them and felt relief beside the sadness. The first time you chose sleep instead of waiting for a message. The first time you realized peace might cost you the relationship. By the time the final separation became visible, your heart had been walking toward the door for months. They understand that now. And they are grieving all the moments when they could have noticed. But there is another layer to this story, one they have barely allowed themselves to face. They did notice some of those moments. They simply believed you would never follow through. This is the truth that wounds their conscience most deeply. There were times they saw your exhaustion. They heard the change in your voice. They felt you withdrawing. But instead of responding with urgency, they relied on your history of staying. Your loyalty became their excuse to delay. They gambled with your heart because you had forgiven them before. Now they cannot forgive themselves for making your goodness the reason they did not change. That is the regret beneath every other regret. They did not just fail to protect your love. They used the strength of your love to justify their weakness. And when that truth surfaced, something inside them broke. Perhaps they sat on the edge of the bed, holding a phone that contained messages they had once answered carelessly. Perhaps they scrolled upward through old conversations, discovering tenderness hidden between ordinary words. You had asked whether they ate. You had remembered an important day. You had sent encouragement before something difficult. You had tried to make them laugh. You had offered love in forms so quiet that they mistook them for routine. Now each line felt like evidence. Not evidence against them in a court of punishment, but evidence of what they had been given. The past appeared differently because regret had changed their vision. A message they once read in seconds now took minutes to absorb. A simple, "I'm here," became devastating. A heart emoji became a doorway into the version of you who still believed. Then they found something they had forgotten. A message from you sent long before the ending. It was not angry. It was not dramatic. It carried a gentleness that made the words more painful. You had told them that you did not need perfect love. You needed love that was willing to learn. You had told them you were not asking them to have every answer. You were asking them to stop making you carry every question alone. You had told them that your heart could be patient, but it could not survive being taken for granted forever. They read those words once. Then again. Then a third time. And the room became unbearably still. Because everything you later did had already been explained. Your silence was not confusing. Your departure was not sudden. Your needs had not been hidden. You gave them the map. They refused to follow it until the road disappeared. That night, the first honest confession rose within them. I knew they were hurting, and I still waited. Not because they wanted to destroy you. Not because they felt nothing. Sometimes people delay change because they believe love will protect them from consequences. They imagine they have more time than they do. But love is not an endless extension of time. Love is an invitation to be present while the door is open. They understand that now. And yet your story is not meant to end inside their guilt. Heaven's purpose, in this symbolic narration, is not to crush a remorseful heart or make you feel powerful because someone else is suffering. True healing is not built upon revenge. Their regret is not your reward. Your freedom is. You do not need them to remain miserable to prove that you mattered. You do not need their life to fall apart so your love can be validated. Their pain may teach them. Their growth may transform them. Their future choices may become kinder because of what they lost. But none of that changes your responsibility to protect the life still unfolding in front of you. You are allowed to release the need to witness their consequences. You are allowed to hope they heal without volunteering to become the place where they practice. You are allowed to believe their remorse is real while also believing your boundaries are necessary. Compassion and access are not the same thing. Forgiveness and reunion are not the same thing. Love and self-abandonment were never meant to be the same thing. The person you are becoming understands this. And there is dignity in that understanding. For too long, you thought strength meant enduring. Now you are learning that strength can also mean ending a cycle. It can mean choosing not to return to the room where you were repeatedly asked to disappear. You survived the uncertainty. You survived the empty promises. You survived the loneliness of loving someone who did not know how to meet you at the depth where you lived. Now your heart is learning a new rhythm. A rhythm that does not rise and fall according to another person's attention. A rhythm that does not mistake anxiety for passion. A rhythm that makes room for rest. They sense that rhythm from afar, even if they cannot name it. Your energy no longer feels like waiting. It feels like becoming. And that is why their regret has grown sharper. They can imagine you happy without them now. Not because someone else has necessarily entered your life. Not because your healing is complete. But because your spirit has begun belonging to you again. You are laughing without checking whether they noticed. You are dreaming without placing them at the center of every future. You are beginning to recognize that being chosen by another person is not the same as choosing yourself. The thought of you moving forward forces them to face what they wasted. They once had access to a heart that would have built something lasting. Now they do not know whether they will ever meet that version of you again. Yet there is a question they have not answered. Do they regret losing you because they have truly changed, or because they can no longer reach you? This question matters. Loss can create intensity without creating transformation. A person may feel overwhelming emotion when access ends. They may romanticize the past. They may promise everything in the presence of grief. But remorse becomes meaningful only when it changes the way someone lives. Are they facing their patterns? Are they learning to communicate before silence becomes a weapon? Are they becoming accountable without demanding immediate forgiveness? Are they respecting your distance, or trying to use their pain to pull you back into responsibility for them? These are the deeper measures. Words can express regret. Change reveals understanding. And somewhere within their struggle, they know that an apology would not be enough. They could say they miss you. You already know what missing feels like. They could say they love you. Love without safety was part of what hurt you. They could say they are sorry. But you once accepted apologies that returned you to the same pain. This time, something more would be required. Not a perfect performance. Not grand gestures. Truth. Patience. Consistency. The humility to understand that your forgiveness, should it ever come, would not erase the consequences. They have begun drafting words they do not know whether they have the right to send. In this fictional scene, imagine them sitting again near that rain-marked window, the darkness outside beginning to soften toward dawn. Their phone is in their hand. A message box is open. They type your name. Delete it. They write, "I know I hurt you." Delete that too. They begin again. "I have been thinking about everything." The sentence feels inadequate. Everything is too large. How do you fit months of regret into a few lines? How do you explain that a person finally understands the value of a heart after teaching it how to leave? They place the phone down. Walk away. Return. The unsent message waits like a mirror. They are afraid of your silence, but they are more afraid of what your response might reveal. Perhaps you have forgiven them and moved on. Perhaps you no longer feel what you once felt. Perhaps you will read the words and remember every time they spoke too late. Perhaps you will not read them at all. This uncertainty is part of the consequence they once placed upon you. You spent so long wondering where you stood in their heart. Now they are the one standing outside certainty. But even this reversal is not the central revelation. Something else happened before they opened that message box. Something they have told no one. A detail connected to the last conversation between you. A moment they previously remembered one way, until an unexpected discovery forced them to see it differently. The discovery came through something ordinary. Not a prophecy. Not a supernatural guarantee. An object they had kept without thinking. Perhaps it was a folded piece of paper inside a book. Perhaps a photograph tucked into a drawer. Perhaps a voice recording saved among hundreds of forgotten files. In this story, it was a small handwritten note you had once left for them on a difficult day. They found it while searching for something else. The paper was worn at the edges. Your handwriting leaned slightly across the page. At first, they smiled. Then they began reading. You had written about how proud you were of them. You had reminded them that they were more than their worst moments. You had told them that even when they struggled to believe in themselves, you could still see the person they were becoming. But near the bottom, there was one final line. A line they had barely noticed when you first gave it to them. It said that you hoped one day they would believe they were worthy of a love they did not have to run from. They read it, and their hands began to tremble. Because suddenly they saw the relationship from a perspective they had never considered. You had not only loved them. You had seen the fear beneath their behavior. You had understood that part of them kept creating distance because receiving real love threatened every painful belief they carried about themselves. They thought they were protecting themselves from being abandoned. But beneath that fear was something even deeper. They were afraid that if you truly loved them and stayed, they would eventually have to face the possibility that their wounds had been lying to them. Your love challenged the identity they had built around disappointment. It asked them to believe they could be safe. It asked them to trust. It asked them to stop hiding behind the story that everyone leaves. And instead of accepting that challenge, they pushed until the old story became true again. They caused the ending they feared so they would not have to face the beginning they deserved. That was the hidden conflict. They did not lose you because they felt nothing. They lost you because being loved by you brought them too close to the places within themselves they had avoided for years. This does not excuse what happened. But it explains why their regret feels like more than heartbreak. They know now that they were not only rejecting you. They were rejecting healing. They were standing at the doorway of a different life and choosing the familiar darkness because light felt unfamiliar. Your love became a mirror. They looked away. Now the mirror is gone, and they are finally seeing themselves. This realization has placed them at a crossroads. They can continue punishing themselves, turning regret into another form of avoidance. They can say, "I am terrible. I ruin everything. I do not deserve forgiveness," and use shame as an excuse to remain unchanged. Or they can accept the harder path. They can take responsibility without making their guilt the center of the story. They can learn from what happened. They can become honest enough to stop repeating the pattern. Self-forgiveness is not pretending the harm did not matter. It is deciding that the harm will not be wasted. That is the lesson waiting before them. But they have not fully chosen it yet. Part of them believes suffering is the only way to honor what they lost. They replay the past because pain feels like proof that you mattered. They fear that if they forgive themselves, they will be betraying you again. They do not understand that endless guilt serves no one. Not you. Not them. Not the future relationships their unhealed patterns may touch. Real remorse must eventually become responsibility. And responsibility must become change. There is a quiet spiritual truth here for you as well. You may have been trying to forgive yourself. Not for losing them, but for staying so long. For ignoring your intuition. For returning after promises that did not last. For shrinking your needs to make the relationship easier to maintain. For loving someone after the evidence told you love alone was not enough. Please hear this gently. You did what you could with the hope and understanding you had at the time. You were not foolish because you believed in transformation. You were not weak because you forgave. You were learning. And now that learning has become wisdom. Do not use today's clarity to punish yesterday's heart. That version of you deserves tenderness too. They were trying to save something meaningful. They did not yet understand that they could not save it alone. You can forgive yourself without denying what it cost. You can honor the love you gave without returning to the pain that received it. You can look back and say, "I should have left sooner," while still holding compassion for the person who was not ready. This is how your healing and their regret are secretly connected. Both of you stand before the question of self-forgiveness, but from opposite sides of the wound. They must forgive themselves for not valuing you while you were present. You must forgive yourself for measuring your value by how they treated you. They must learn that fear is not permission to hurt someone. You must learn that empathy is not an obligation to remain available. They must stop running from accountability. You must stop running back to what broke you whenever loneliness speaks. Both journeys require truth. But only yours is your responsibility. The night is nearly over in this imagined scene. A thin line of light begins appearing beyond the window. The person who lost you remains awake, the note resting beside the phone. They read your final line once more. They remember the hope you held for them. And they begin to cry, not loudly, but with the quiet devastation of someone who has finally understood that they were loved in a way they did not know how to receive. For a few moments, they allow themselves to feel everything. The tenderness. The shame. The gratitude. The grief. Then they pick up the phone. The unfinished message is still there. This time, they do not begin with an excuse. They do not write about how much they are suffering. They do not ask whether you miss them. They write a sentence they have never been brave enough to say. You were not hard to love. I was afraid to be loved. They stare at those words. Their thumb hovers near the screen. But before they can continue, another memory rises. A memory from your final conversation. You had said something just before walking away, something they thought they understood at the time. They believed you were simply asking them to let you go. Now, after finding the note and facing the truth about their fear, they realize your last words contained another meaning entirely. You were not only saying goodbye. You were leaving them with a choice. And as the first light of morning entered the room, they finally remembered the exact sentence you whispered, a sentence that revealed what would have to happen before your heart could ever safely hear from them again.